Guard and Maritime Transportation will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement for 5 minutes. Today, the subcommittee meets for our latest hearing in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee's America Builds series to review the Coast Guard's modernization efforts. I'd like to welcome our witnesses, Vice Admiral Tom Allan, Acting Deputy Commandant for Operations, and Heather MacLeod, Director of Justice and Homeland Security Programs at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, who is accompanied by Shelby Oakley, Director of Contracting and National Security Acquisitions at the United States Government Accountability Office. That was a mouthful. Thank you all for being here today. Every day, the Coast Guard is called upon to save lives, respond to emergencies, protect the environment, enforce our laws, secure the maritime border from drugs and illegal immigrants, and maintain the flow of maritime commerce. The brave sentinels who carry out these missions should be supported by reliable ships, helicopters, and airplanes, but instead members of the Coast Guard at times find themselves on vessels and air assets that should have been retired long ago. The Coast Guard's ability to do more with less has unfortunately encouraged years of underinvestment and ever-increasing mission demands that have pushed the service to the breaking point. Today, the Coast Guard faces a $7 billion shoreside infrastructure backlog with barracks, hangars, and docks that are literally crumbling, leaking, or both. The service's medium endurance cutters are increasingly unable to carry out their missions. Our icebreaker fleet is unable to project our nation's sovereignty in the Arctic, and flight mechanics are performing miracles to keep the Coast Guard's aging aviation assets in the air. While the Coast Guard is well into a multi-decade modernization plan that has seen fast response cutters and national security cutters come online, progress on other programs remain dangerously behind schedule. Since the subcommittee last examined the Coast Guard's modernization efforts in June, the Polar Security Cutter program continues to crawl forward, but we need to continue to see meaningful progress. The subcommittee is encouraged by the Coast Guard's past statements highlighting the importance of the acquisition, and we expect you to continue to prioritize this critical program. Concerns with the Offshore Patrol Cutter program remain as we prepare for the lead ship to be delivered at the end of this year, 4 years late, and with a host of non-compliant parts. In addition, new problems have developed with the last hulls in the National Security Cutter program, and we could receive one ship less than what Congress has appropriated. At the same time, efforts to modernize the service's aviation fleet have taken steps back, with MH-60 and C-27s being phased out earlier than planned. Failure to successfully acquire new surface and air assets and the shore infrastructure required to support them is a true crisis for the Coast Guard. Without them, the service cannot carry out its missions. The failure to appropriate adequate funds year after year is a significant factor contributing to this problem, but it's not the only one. Broken contracting process and inadequate planning and review efforts have dug the Coast Guard deeper into the hole. To encourage proper oversight, Congress requires yearly capital investment plans and major acquisition reports. These plans are not optional. They are required by law. Yet the Coast Guard fails to produce them, and this is unacceptable. As chairman of this subcommittee, I am committed to reviewing the Coast Guard's contracting and planning efforts and working with the service to improve them. I also applaud the President for a strong vision in helping our shipbuilding industry back on track. In his speech last night, he set a clear leadership vision for investing in American shipyards through the establishment of a shipbuilding office to strengthen our domestic capacity, our local economy, and local workforce. Vice Admiral Allan, I am eager to hear your plan to right the ship so that we can get the men and women of the Coast Guard the assets they need to carry out their missions. Director MacLeod and Ms. Oakley, I look forward to you both bringing a dose of reality to the Coast Guard's plans. Thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to our discussion. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Carbajal, for an opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will yield to our Transportation and Infrastructure Ranking Member, Representative Larson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair Zell and Ranking Member Carbajal. Today's hearing provides an opportunity for this subcommittee to take a closer look at how the Coast Guard is balancing its asset needs across mission sets and the budget crisis impacting the Coast Guard. It further provides an opportunity to discuss how this administration views the future of the service as well. For instance, under Admiral Fagan's leadership, the service boldly advocated for $20 billion in funding by 2030. When Admiral Fagan took the helm, the Coast Guard was experiencing major recruiting shortfalls. Just prior to her ouster, the Coast Guard announced that it had fully reversed the trend and surpassed recruiting goals and set in place a foundation to continue meeting those goals. And I'm concerned the recent actions by the administration will undo that progress. Admiral Fagan also inherited from former Coast Guard leadership a disaster of accountability and trust in the form of Operation Fouled Anchor. Instead of pointing fingers, she conducted the accountability and transparency review, which included a comprehensive path toward addressing sexual assault and sexual harassment in the Coast Guard. This administration has the opportunity to build upon that strong foundation that Admiral Fagan left, and I expect today to hear that plan, especially with regards to the issue at hand. The Coast Guard is underway on multiple major acquisitions, including the National Security Cutter, Offshore Patrol Cutters, Polar Security Cutters, and the Waterways Commerce Cutters. Unfortunately, every one of these acquisition programs has experienced significant delays and budgetary issues. Since our last hearing, the service now projects the first Polar Security Cutter will not be delivered until 2033 and may cost 3 times more than the original contract award. As the Coast Guard continues to work with Bollinger Shipyards to chart a path forward, I am interested to hear how we can leverage the ICE Pact agreement to cut those costs and reduce the timeline. The HC-130J aircraft has been an essential asset for the Coast Guard aviation fleet, providing better range, speed, and technology than its predecessor. Unfortunately, the program is stalled at 19 frames due to lack of funding, even though the program of record calls for 22. This, coupled with the unplanned retirement of the C-27 fleet and a reduction in the lifespan of H-60 helicopters, creates a significant gap in Coast Guard aviation capabilities. This gap will continue to grow if we have aircraft diverted away from essential missions. Recent executive orders have diverted Coast Guard personnel and C-130s to the southern border to relocate migrants from California to Texas and move people and cargo to Guantanamo Bay. And I'm concerned that the Coast Guard is making haphazard operational decisions without regard to the impact on its other missions. As Congress funds the construction of assets, we need to ensure appropriate funding for shoreside infrastructure. This includes piers, workstations, housing, healthcare, and childcare. People are the Coast Guard's greatest asset, and their experience in the service, the Coast Guard must prioritize their experience in the service. In 2019, the GAO reported that the infrastructure project backlog was nearing $3 billion. 6 years later, that backlog has grown to $7 billion. Without immediate investments, the problem will worsen. Now, I have visited, as many of us have, visited numerous Coast Guard stations across the country. I've seen firsthand the unacceptable living and working conditions, and no service member should be asked to live with mold or asbestos, nor should they have to work with a tarp over their head. They all deserve better. I understand that additional funding for the Coast Guard is under consideration in the reconciliation package. While I support giving the Coast Guard additional funding, I won't support that funding that comes at the cost of everyday Americans. We can and we should fund the Coast Guard while also supporting all American families. The Coast Guard is facing a pivotal moment. Its budget and workforce are strained, acquisitions are delayed, assets are aging, and infrastructure is crumbling. So I expect to hear today how the Coast Guard will move forward and build upon Admiral Fagan's work to create a legacy for years to come. I want to thank Chair Zell and Ranking Member Carbajal, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Carbajal for his 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ezell, and thank you to our witnesses being here today. The United States Coast Guard has been undergoing a significant recapitalization effort for almost 2 decades, the largest of its kind since World War II. Congress's attention on this issue is timely and imperative to the future success of the Coast Guard. Unfortunately, before I can move on to the topic of the hearing, I must address serious concern I have with recent decisions. The Coast Guard has decided to gut internal programs in the spirit of canceling initiatives promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Unfortunately, what they've actually done is limit the service's ability to promote leadership, honor, respect, and camaraderie. As a veteran myself, I know the importance of these programs. The Coast Guard has decided that even though they have exceeded their recruitment numbers this past year, thanks to the former Commandant's outreach to minority communities is no longer important. This administration seems more interested in scoring political points instead of taking care of the people who drive the boats, fly the planes, and run the command centers. I am very concerned that recent actions and ongoing uncertainty is going to affect recruiting and retention. Turning to the matter at hand, over the past 5 years, and in almost every case, procurement efforts have been over budget and over schedule. We must address the ongoing production issues, the service's long-term planning, and the consistent underfunding of programs to ensure timely and cost-effective procurement. The offshore patrol cutter program has essentially stagnated, suffering significant delays and cost overruns, including a bailout to a shipyard which the Coast Guard could never truly afford. The incredible lack of foresight and planning for these issues leaves us with more bills instead of ships. At this point, there is still no real beginning in sight for the Polar Security Cutter. With respect to air assets, the Coast Guard operated a fleet of almost 200 aircraft, 146 helicopters, and 47 fixed-wing aircraft in January 2024. Currently, the Coast Guard is in the process of phasing out the short-range MH-65 helicopters in favor of the medium-range MH-60 helicopters. At the same time, the Coast Guard also reduced the service life of the MH-60s and reduced the overall fleet to 127. We seem to be going backwards here. Further still, due to the lack of support from appropriators, the service has ended the program to missionize 12 C-27s airplanes. With the administration's excessive focus on diverting and overtaxing Coast Guard resources for maritime border security, I fear the Coast Guard's aging assets are going to fail at an exponential pace with no fallback plan. This will affect the Coast Guard's ability to execute missions, including search and rescue across the country. Just last week, the Coast Guard testified in the Senate hearing that while underway, a 42-year-old cutter conducting maritime security operations was actively taking on water through a rusted hole in the hull. How is this acceptable? To risk the lives of our coasties and those they serve in ways that are completely preventable. The Government Accountability Office issued a report that estimated the Coast Guard's $7 billion estimate for the shoreside infrastructure backlog is actually higher. Over 200 projects still have no cost estimates, and none have been adjusted for inflation. The shoreside infrastructure backlog directly impacts coasties and their families. We must do better. I have said before, and I will say it again, we must fund the Coast Guard at levels significantly higher than requested and appropriated in recent years. I fully support the service's push to be a $20 billion agency, including the need to more than double the procurement, construction, and improvement account. Congress and Coast Guard leadership owe it to the personnel to deliver this. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to thank you all for coming here today, and I'm going to explain the lighting system to you. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means start concluding your remarks. I ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the committee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Vice Admiral, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Ezell, Ranking Member Larson, and Ranking Member Carvajal. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to update you on the Coast Guard's acquisition programs. Every day, the Coast Guard men and women answer the call to support national priorities in service of the American people. Our unique skills, capabilities, and authorities support the national imperative to control our borders and maritime approaches, control a nation's ports and waterways, and conduct military operations to defend the nation. One of the nation's most critical acquisitions and the Coast Guard's #1 priority is the Polar Security Cutter. The Polar Security Cutter is being built by Bollinger, Mississippi, and the United States has not built one of these multi-mission heavy polar icebreakers for over 50 years. The heavy icebreaker is technically sophisticated and demands talented craftsmen across all trades to build this 23,000-ton ship. I'm proud to say we are now meeting our milestones to deliver this icebreaker that will provide assured year-round access to the polar regions in support of critical and emergent activities protecting U.S. interests. This past December, we received continued authority to build out up to 16 of 85 sections of that Polar Security Cutter. We increased design maturity above 90%, and we are nearing a decision by DHS for full production. To meet immediate needs, we recently also acquired a commercially available polar icebreaker, the only one in the nation. It will sail in Alaskan waters this summer. Simultaneously, we are working to deliver the Offshore Patrol Cutter, more commonly known as OPC. There are 5 OPCs currently in production. The lead OPC from Stage 1 is scheduled for delivery in the first quarter of fiscal year 2026. And the Stage 2 contract will deliver its first OPC in fiscal year 2027. In addition to a ready cutter fleet, we continue our efforts to deliver robust aviation capabilities critical to the Coast Guard's ability to meet mission demands in a constantly changing global maritime environment. Our MH-60 Jayhawk helicopters fleet will continue to play an even larger role in our mission as the MH-65 Dolphin platform approaches its service end of life. We established a program baseline to extend the service life of our MH-60 fleet and to equip more of our air stations with this capable asset. Separately, we are pursuing a program of record of 22 HC-130Js to enhance the Coast Guard's airborne presence, incident response, and maritime patrol capabilities. Earlier this year, we took delivery of our 18th C-130J 2 months ahead of schedule. These aircraft are the sole providers of heavy lift capability for DHS. Every Coast Guard mission begins and ends at a shore facility, and investment in the Coast Guard shore infrastructure portfolio is critical to maximizing the effectiveness and utility of our new, highly capable assets. Coast Guard facilities are steadily declining due to lack of maintenance resources, and many of our new assets require support that Coast Guard legacy infrastructure is simply not designed to provide. We continue to carefully direct our limited resources to our most critical needs to provide mission-ready home ports, air stations, maintenance facilities, and housing, but we need your support to significantly increase funding for survey and design, as well as construction of vital infrastructure to base our critical assets and workforce. The demand for Coast Guard capabilities and presence is only growing, and we look forward to continuing to serve the nation. But we need your support for continued investment in the Coast Guard, our surface and aviation capabilities, infrastructure, and personnel. While conducting operations today, we must also develop the capabilities and personnel required to meet tomorrow's maritime security challenges. I appreciate the subcommittee's continued bipartisan support, and I look forward to our continued work together on advancing vital acquisition programs important to delivering Coast Guard support to the nation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Thank you. Now, Ms. MacLeod, you are recognized for 5 minutes of your testimony.
Chairman Easel, Ranking Member Carbajal, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss GAO's recent work on the condition and management of the Coast Guard's infrastructure. My testimony today includes information from our work on these issues and Coast Guard's progress in implementing our related recommendations. Coast Guard infrastructure assets are vast and include more than 20,000 facilities at over 2,700 locations. These include piers, runways, and buildings from which it carries out its operations. Good management of these facilities is critical to the success of Coast Guard operations. However, our work has raised concerns related to the Coast Guard's increasingly costly backlog of shore infrastructure projects. 3 years ago, I testified before this committee that the backlogs totaled over $2 billion. GAO's updated analysis shows that these backlogs totaled at least $7 billion at the end of last year. And almost half of Coast Guard's shore infrastructure is beyond its service life. These shore infrastructure backlogs include items ranging from sinkholes at the Coast Guard Yard, training facilities at Coast Guard Academy and Cape May, and housing units where service members and their families live. In the past, Coast Guard estimated that it would take hundreds of years to address this backlog, and current funding levels are only adequate to address the most pressing needs, which tend to be unplanned repairs. This is particularly concerning not only because of the estimated funding needed to address the backlogs, but because of other potential impacts. For example, we have identified that deferring maintenance can lead to higher costs in the long term, while also posing risks to safety, security, readiness, and mission execution. In our prior work, GAO made 6 recommendations to improve the Coast Guard shore infrastructure management efforts. Coast Guard agreed with all of these recommendations and, in some cases, has taken steps towards addressing them. For example, Coast Guard developed new way to standardize facility condition assessments and issued guidance to prioritize critical infrastructure. These are promising steps, and the Coast Guard could further improve management of its infrastructure with additional action in the following 4 areas. First, the Coast Guard must find ways to report shore infrastructure information more completely and accurately in congressionally required plans and budget requests. This includes providing supporting details about competing project alternatives and trade-offs. Doing so could help Congress prioritize funding to address the Coast Guard's shore infrastructure backlogs. The Coast Guard should employ models to help prioritize investments across its shore infrastructure portfolio. The Coast Guard should complete efforts to align mission needs with shore infrastructure assets. By doing this process, the Coast Guard may identify and be able to dispose of unnecessary assets. This could lead to cost savings. And lastly, the Coast Guard needs to develop baselines and goals to be able to track the effectiveness of its maintenance and repair efforts. In closing, Coast Guard has taken some positive steps, but could do more to improve the management of its vast and aging infrastructure. Fully addressing GAO's recommendations will help the Coast Guard to better manage its resources, identify cost savings, and provide Congress with better information to address shore infrastructure challenges. GAO will continue to follow up with the Coast Guard on these issues. This completes my prepared statement, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. MacLeod. And thank you both for your testimony. We will now turn to questions for the panel. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. Vice Admiral Allan, in order to ensure Congress is able to carry out its oversight functions, we require you to provide a yearly capital investment plan, a biannual report on major acquisitions, and a quarterly acquisition brief. You have never provided this committee with a major acquisition report. You have not provided a capital investment plan since FY '23, and even that was a year late, sir. And we have not received an acquisition brief since Q3 of last year. Given the challenges with the Coast Guard's acquisition efforts, why does the Coast Guard refuse to follow the law and produce information that you are required to provide for us?
Sir, thank you for the question, and we need to get better. Three things I'll promise to you today.
Okay.
We will deliver the capital investment plan to you 60 days after the president's budget is delivered to the Hill. The second thing we'll do is before April 1st, I will ensure that your staff gets a quarterly acquisitions brief. We're streamlining that brief to provide it in a more succinct manner, but to answer all your questions because we see you as a very important part of us being able to move forward. And then third, we are working on an aviation strategy that you also asked us to do, and we commit that we will get that to you before the end of April in a brief to make sure you understand where we are in our aviation strategy and where we're going.
Very good. The Coast Guard plans to acquire larger cutters and aircraft over the next decade, but it appears a lack of detailed plan on where those new assets will be based, as well as a plan to build out the required infrastructure needed to operate them. These projects take years, and if you don't start now, you'll be running into serious problems when the new assets come online. As you know, the committee asked for a plan, and we were provided with a short document which I'm displaying on the screen now, that lists future ships without plans for home ports. This is not acceptable response. Does the Coast Guard have a long-term plan of the shoreside capital investments needed to home port new cutters and aircraft that it plans to bring online over the next decade? And if so, can you commit to providing the committee with a detailed schedule and cost projections for these projects?
Sir, thank you for that question. This is an important decision for us too, where we put our cutters, where we put our assets to make sure they're best used. I will tell you, one of the biggest things we hate doing is traveling with you or other members to talk about a cost of a project that we're going to do, to execute, to put something there, and those numbers are based upon back of the napkin calculations. As Ms. MacLeod talked about, we need to do more on survey and design. We need to look into those projects, and we need to develop that so that we give you a clear understanding of what the cost is, what's going to be provided, and where it's going to be. At this point, we have a lack of funding within our survey and design. We would appreciate the ability to work with you to increase survey and design so that we can get after the things that you're looking for, because we're interested in them as well.
Thank you. The Coast Guard has long maintained the full rate production of offshore patrol cutters, 2 per year, is necessary to prevent a catastrophic loss of mission capability. The Coast Guard continues to project that OPC full rate production will begin in fiscal year '26, less than 1 year from now. Is the Coast Guard confident that DHS and OMB support a 2-year production, and what is your plan if they do not?
Sir, thank you for that question. I've always appreciated this committee because you always ask us to come and tell you what we need. Yep. We need OPCs out in the field now. We are watching our MECs, as we just talked about in some of the opening statements, take on flooding, take on water, not being able to do their mission. So it's very important for us to go to 2 now. We continue to say that the Coast Guard is a $20 billion organization operating on a $12 billion budget. We need to get that at $20 billion, and part of that $20 billion needs to be $4 billion in PC&I future force money. What I would say, sir, is that we are interested in there. We need to get there, so I'm going to continue to tell you what we need, and then we're going to look for the best way to get there.
Got it. Is the Coast Guard confident that the Stage 2 OPCs will have attained a level of design maturity and construction maturity by fiscal year '26, that the service will be able to certify those cutters as ready to move to full rate production?
Yes, sir. We visited them in November. They are moving right along. They have a 97% 2D and 3D design maturity, and they will be ready to build.
Thank you, and I yield back. I'll come back with some more questions later, and I'll give some extended time if we need it, but I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First question's for Ms. Oakley, and thanks for joining us. I understand you do specific Coast Guard procurement acquisition. So you just heard Admiral Allan. What's GAO's view of the procurement process now at the Coast Guard? Can they achieve this? What's your evaluation of the process? I'm sorry, I'm getting a little distracted from outside.
I didn't hear what you said there.
I don't think people are protesting in Coast Guard today, so I don't have to worry about it. But what's your evaluation of the Coast Guard's procurement process today, and can they achieve it? If we gave them the money, and we'd like to, can they achieve these goals?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges with the procurement process. I mean, we see this across the board with committing to overly optimistic schedules and cost estimates, and therefore also signing contracts that are overly optimistic for the level of risk that are associated with the programs that they're undertaking. You know, for example, we're kind of talking about all these risks on PSC right now. If we haven't built a PSC in, 50 years, we have a lack of expertise, all these things that were known at the beginning of the program, but that weren't adequately factored in through that procurement process. And that's exactly the kind of thing that needs to get better at the beginning of the process so that everybody goes in eyes wide open, knowing and understanding what the risks are and what the outcomes will be, such that we're not always continually disappointed as baselines slip and as costs increase.
So a few of us have served on the Armed Services Committee, and I'm not lifting up the Navy shipbuilding process as the ideal. It's better than the Coast Guard's process, but it's not ideal. Also, we've got the lessons from Deepwater, the massive procurement in the 2000s, and learned some lessons from that. Are any of those lessons being applied as a Coast Guard, in your view, being applied as they think through this procurements over the next 10 years?
Yeah, so first let me say the Navy has its own problems, and it has a lot more resources to hide its problems than the Coast Guard does, and I think that's part of the challenge. But I think that, when you kind of consider, the state of the industrial base and what we're dealing with from a shipbuilding perspective, that's a national issue. And so when you kind of think about, has the Coast Guard gotten better, even if they've implemented changes around the margins to improve, for example, getting even close to 97% design stability on the Polar Security Cutter is a lot better than prior decisions that have been made. I think the status of the industrial base really challenges these programs to be able to continue to make progress on these shipbuilding programs over and over again. And we just issued a report last week on the Navy shipbuilding and ship repair industrial base, where the themes and issues that we identify that are affecting the outcomes on those programs are extremely similar to what they're challenged with in the Coast Guard programs.
Yeah. I don't think we have a problem outfitting any of these ships with the avionics or the radars and all that. It's actually building the platform to stick these things on.
Yeah.
It seems, I want to switch gears a little bit from Ms. MacLeod. As recently as yesterday, the acting commandant of the Coast Guard informed me that the accountability and transparency review implementation is proceeding as planned. Is that what you understand from the Coast Guard as well?
We have work underway on this issue, looking at sexual misconduct in the Coast Guard and follow-up actions related to Operation Fouled Anchor and the ATR. We have an outstanding request for a meeting that dating back a few weeks, if not months at this point, on an update on progress related to the ATR and whether the actions outlined still apply today.
An outstanding request for a meeting with the Coast Guard?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, excellent. That's good to know. We can help you with that. I think. So, Admiral Allan, so as we look forward and we're looking at reconciliation and some of the numbers being tossed around by the Senate and the House or so on, a little bit different, but certainly larger, can we expect the Coast Guard to continue to advocate for the larger annual budget regardless of the reconciliation amount? And even if you got a larger number, you still need to stay engaged and not like celebrate 1 year. The celebration is going to take place long after you and I are gone. So what are you thinking put in place so that you have a consistent effort to chase those dollars in the regular budget process?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. I think as we've talked to OMB, as we've talked to DHS as they're coming in and we're talking about this reconciliation, they have talked about the need to catch the Coast Guard up in many of the acquisition reports, but they are still looking at keeping their foot on the gas. What they told us is they need to have us at a $20 billion organization by the end of this president's term.
That's great, and achieving Admiral Fagan's goal 2 years ahead of time, that'd be wonderful. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. McDowell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here to testify before us today. Vice Admiral Allan, why was the discrepancy between the President's budget request for fiscal year 25 and the amount authorized in the Coast Guard reauthorization bill so large?
Thank you for that question, sir. So I think when we go through the budget process, there is always a top line. And I think when we start looking at the top line and we look at how the Coast Guard competes within DHS, that's been a hard place for us to be. We often come up to these committees and talk to the committees about how we can go into unfunded priority lists, and in many cases, our top line raises there. We are heartened to see the current administration making the priority for us to move from our current budget to a $20 billion budget.
Thank you. And just to follow up, what would be the consequences for the Coast Guard if they continue to receive inadequate funding to support the operations?
Thank you for the question. I would say it's what we're seeing. We're seeing vessels that are out operating and become hold and are taking on water and have to go off that mission. It's the morale of the people that are living in buildings that are not adequate for them to do command and control of our assets offshore, to sleep in overnight, or the housing that they need. It's for the aviation assets that we have to be cut at 19,000 hours and have 7 of those tied up on the ground because they don't have the dollars to replace them.
Well, sir, it seems to me that a hole in a boat is a problem that we should address. I'd like to pivot briefly to talk about the Coast Guard's mission to enforce maritime law and to secure our ports of entry. This administration has taken divisive and swift action to secure our southern and northern border. But we can speculate that once we do that, drug traffickers, human traffickers, they're not going to just stop. They're going to continue to try to come into our country from one way or the other, and that would point to you all and our west and east. And so as our southern borders become increasingly locked down, what actions is the Coast Guard taking to ensure that our east and west coast ports of entry are equipped for any diverted illegal activity, and what specific support would you need to continue to carry out your responsibility to countering illicit smuggling, human trafficking, and drug interdiction?
Thank you for that question. When Congress built the Coast Guard, they provided us with a lot of authorities, a lot of broad authorities. It doesn't make us do only one mission at a time. We can quickly switch between search and rescue, alien migration, fisheries, border control, and we're doing that right now. To this point, since January, we have taken and interdicted almost 348 aliens. We've taken over 1,000 tons of drugs off the water, and we are working to do that more. Because of our authorities and because of our placement across the country, we have the ability to maintain that, and the Commandant Admiral Lundy, the acting commandant, has asked us to make border sustainment a priority as we do this, while we continue to keep our eye on the other missions to make sure that we don't let those fall, because those all have requirements that we need to meet.
Well, thank you. As a member of Congress that represents North Carolina, the North Carolina 6th District, which, our state was hit hard by hurricanes recently, and it's important to me that the federal government is ready to be able to rapidly assist with natural disasters. How could funding the Coast Guard's C-130 fleet help with inland disaster response?
Sir, the C-130 is the only heavy lift capable aircraft within the DHS inventory. Right now, we are using that to support other DHS components along the southern border to move assets and people. We have a program, a record of 22, plus we have 8 C-27s. Those C-27s will be sunsetting in 2028 because of our ability to support them. We're just not getting the parts or the ability to do that. So we'll be down. Our ability to build more C-130s or another like aircraft to the C-27 is needed for us to continue to do the operations and support that the country expects.
Thank you, sir, and I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carbajal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral Allan, Coast Guard housing is an ongoing concern of mine. In my district in Santa Barbara, housing is incredibly expensive, so coasties often rely on Coast Guard housing. Unfortunately, like many other places around the country, Coast Guard housing in Santa Barbara is substandard with mold, collapsing floorboards, and persistent water issues. How does the Coast Guard prioritize housing projects given the systemic nature of the issue?
Sir, our people are our most important asset, and we've got to treat them like that. We don't always do that when it comes to funding. We've got a $24.7 billion plant value of the infrastructure that we have for the Coast Guard. We think we need about 2 to 4% every year to be able to maintain that at standards. If we had those standards and that funding from the beginning of those facilities, we are getting about half of that. What we would say is right now, what we're doing is trying to do tiger teams. When we see problems, especially with housing, we're going into those areas. We're doing immediate remediation. We're putting in humidifiers. We're trying to get after standing water. I know the facilities that you're talking about specifically, we're going to continue to work with those residents so that we make sure we understand when or if that mold comes back, that we are modifying those to make sure that they live safe and comfortably in those houses.
Thank you. Well, many of those issues still persist in my district, so I do hope that you can give that your undivided attention. Admiral Allan, DHS has recently terminated the membership of the Federal Advisory Councils. For the Coast Guard, those councils are critical to providing input from industry to ensure safety and keeping mariners and passengers safe. What was wrong with the membership of the advisory councils, many of which the composition is mandated by statute? And when does the Coast Guard plan to reconstitute them?
Sir, thank you for the question. As a Coast Guard officer, as you know, we're going to continue 235 years of tradition of following the orders and directives of the Commander-in-Chief. That's what we do. For this case, I think what we did was a lot of these were signed with the approval of the executive branch, and we are going to work to add people to these because these committees are important. I know that the administration sees these as important, and they're working to put those onto their work list for moving forward.
Thank you. Admiral Allan, what is the cost per flight to transport migrants on Coast Guard C-130s versus commercial option costs? Are there any discussions with the department on whether the Coast Guard will be reimbursed for those expenses?
Sir, every year we provide a certain level of hours that we commit to our C-130s for different missions. Right now, we are prioritizing our missions that those C-130s will conduct. C-130s are more expensive than commercial, and as you know, it depends on the commercial provider and what you're using to do that. The department continues to pay attention to those costs and to look at how to best do this. As usual, the Coast Guard's always involved when there's an emergency and there's an immediate need, and we'll continue to fill that immediate need until the administration prioritizes otherwise.
Are you aware these costs will be reimbursed or not?
Sir, I am not aware that these will be reimbursed. I think that is currently part of our budget.
Thank you, Admiral Allan. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Begich for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is to Vice Admiral Allan. The Coast Guard has announced plans to homeport U.S. Coast Guard cutter Storis in Juneau, but infrastructure upgrades, including shoreline facilities and housing, will take several years. The vessel was acquired to enhance Arctic capabilities while awaiting new polar security cutters. The timeline for homeporting preparations remains uncertain, with formal budget requests expected after design assessments are completed. Given the vessel's role in Arctic operations, prioritizing infrastructure in Juneau is critical to ensuring mission readiness. My first question, what is the current planning phase for homeporting the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Storis in Juneau, and when can Congress expect a formal budget request for necessary infrastructure modifications to support the vessel?
Sir, thank you for that question, and we're very excited to be adding the Storis to our inventory. Providing presence up in the Arctic is something that this nation needs and deserves, especially as we push back on our maligned state actors that are up there right now. For the home port, we have announced and will be putting Storis into Juneau. As you know, we need to first get the pier ready, have buildings on the pier that will be able to support the Storis, and then housing, because housing in Juneau is limited. So we are looking to put that together. Again, as we kind of discussed at the beginning, we don't have survey and design money to be able to carry that out, so we'll be looking for that money to be able to start the process. In the meantime, we'll be sailing the Storis into Alaskan waters this summer. It will be going through Juneau, and it'll be temporarily berthed in Seattle, where we have our other polar security cutters, up until the time that we can complete the facilities in Juneau.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the institutional support for that infrastructure investment in Juneau. A couple additional questions, Vice Admiral. So with respect to the Seward Fast Response Cutter homeporting and the Sitka Fast Response Cutter homeporting, can you give us an update on the status of those homeporting exercises?
Sir, as you know, in Alaska, we're making some major investment. We got over 10 projects, $571 million that we are executing over the next few years. Both of those for the FRCs and Seward and Sitka are high priorities. Right now, we have 2 that are sitting in Kodiak that will be there in the meantime. I will get back to you, sir, and if you would like, we'd love to give you a complete overview on all the projects that we're doing in Alaska. I just don't have that off the top of my head on when we'll complete those 2.
I'd love to get that briefing, and as you're preparing that briefing, if I could get information on anticipated timelines for full operational capabilities, as well as what plans you have in order to secure the remaining funds necessary in order to complete those homeporting exercises.
Yes, sir, we have all that information. I'll be glad to even sit down with you personally and go through that. Yes,
Thank you, Vice Admiral. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Ms. Strickland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Ezell and Ranking Member Carbajal. I represent Washington State, as you know, that has a large military and maritime industry. The Coast Guard provides critical capabilities to our national security and economy, and I'm deeply concerned, like all of my colleagues, about the repeated delays in modernization and the failure to get a Coast Guard Authorization Act across the finish line last Congress. I want to ask specifically about the icebreakers, 3 of which are supposed to be in Seattle. One is scheduled, as you showed on your chart, 2030, 2031, and 2033. As we look at some of the challenges we have with our shipbuilding capability, can you talk a bit about having a skilled workforce, having the facilities to build, and then the supply chain and how that may affect our ability to build these very, very important vessels?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. The polar securities are just our #1 acquisition, and I think vital to the country. I appreciate us coming to this committee because always listen to the committee talking about an industrial base and how it is failing to keep up with our ability to build ships. One thing we know in the Coast Guard is we will not be able to fix the industrial base one contract at a time for each cutter. Every time we do that, we see design delays, we see delays in the workforce as we try to bring them on. I am heartened by what's going on at Bollinger, Mississippi shipyard for the Polar Security Cutter. They are at 90%, over 90%, 91.75 to be exact, 2D design maturity. That's a great thing. We're also got through the department ability to do prototype fabrication assessment on many of the parts that are going to be doing it. And when I say parts, these are giant parts, right? These are 16 prefab. And what we've learned is as we put those together, how we're going to weld, how we're going to treat the steel to make sure that the welds are part. And we are at a point where if we put those pieces together, we are actually greater tonnage than a 270-foot Coast Guard cutter. So we're making progress. To your point, though, we need a stable workforce. So signaling and continuing to fund so we not only get PSC number 1, but PSC number 2 and number 3 will keep that workforce engaged and delivering those ones that we need.
Great, thank you, Vice Admiral. I want to pivot now to a quality of life issue that happened. The same week, a GAO report came out urging the Coast Guard to take cybersecurity threats to our maritime transportation system more seriously. We all know that our two adversaries, Russia and the Chinese Communist Party, represent our biggest threats. The service actually suffered a data breach that delayed pay for over 1,000 personnel. What actionable steps is the Coast Guard taking to meet the cyber threats, both to take care of its own people and protect our maritime infrastructure?
Ma'am, thank you for that question, and I'll tell you, I was one of those 1,000 people that didn't get my paycheck. When you do that, and just as a Vice Admiral, no one cares if I'm getting paid or not, but we know what the impacts are to a E4 that's not getting their pay, that has a wife, that has a kid, and is expecting it. Two things, and I was very proud of the service on this. We noticed this on Thursday. We locked down the system to make sure there wasn't any additional data, and in almost every case, those 1,000 people were paid the next day on a Friday. So one, keeping trust with our people. Two, there are some serious cyber deficits that we have, and we are looking to address it. For this system, we're putting additional safeguards in for how you log in, especially for those that have the ability to manipulate that system, and we'll be done with that by March 14th. While we do that, we've got our cybersecurity teams that are providing overwatch of that particular system to make sure we do it. That said, we've got a lot of other systems, and we continue to work that because cyber is so important, not only in our ability to get on the computer, but to operate our cutters and to make sure we work with industry.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to editorialize a bit and say that, you know, telling Russia to stand down, saying that we're going to stand down against cybersecurity against Russia makes no sense. We know that it's a threat to our national security, it's a threat to our utility grid, and actually can be a threat to our comms grid. So thank you for that testimony. I yield back, Chairman.
Gentlelady yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Van Drew for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you always got to have a lighter side to things for a minute, right? I just happened to think when you said nobody cares whether a vice admiral gets paid, I imagine that's probably true. We share something in common, all of us up here. Nobody gives a damn if Congress gets paid. Let me tell you, they probably wonder why we do sometimes. On a serious note, we've kind of danced this dance, some of it before. All of us, you know, we've spoken before, and just some of the same subjects I want to bring up. And I'm going to state the obvious, what we know. The Coast Guard faces a growing mission demands, but suffers from serious shortfalls in assets. We know it. Infrastructure, recruitment, and long-term planning are still a problem. Despite ongoing modernization efforts, delays and cost overruns have left the service struggling, and they're struggling to meet operational needs, as we know, putting us at a serious disadvantage on the global stage. And as you've heard from me before, and I think from members on both sides of the aisle on this, by the way, this is bipartisan, really upset about it, really want us to do better. We need to do better. And, you know, the Polar Security Cutter program is critical. We know that. We know we only have 2 icebreakers. My colleagues on both sides of the aisle have mentioned it already. Compared to Russia's 55, I believe, 55, far short of the at least 8 or 9 more that we need for core missions, Our aviation fleet's under strain. Our helicopters are slow. We haven't transitioned to new models quickly enough. So let me just ask you this question, and you've answered it before, but I think it's good for some of our new members to hear and others. Vice Admiral, how is the slow procurement of the fleet impacted, and this is, let me get particular to my district for once, the mission readiness of Air Station Atlantic City?
Sir, when we talk about mission readiness, it's all those things. It's our ability to maintain our assets, it's ability to provide the facilities and housing to our crews that are need to operate within them, and then this ability to build new things to support the newer assets that have greater demands than some of our old. So in all those cases, sir, without the proper amount of money, we're having problems doing that. I think everyone in here has had a car that they maybe held on to just a little bit too long, and you start looking at all those costs associated with maintaining it as opposed to spending the money to buy a new one. We are in a point where we are maintaining old cars that take a lot longer.
And I think you're right, and I think we have to focus on this, and I know and hopefully we are going to push forward. There's other examples I could give, other examples we could talk about. You know them, I know them. I think the committee and the chairman knows them. But this is what I'm thinking. I think we need a clear, long-term strategy. I think most people agree with that. One that defines where the assets are going to be in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. The plan's got to be realistic. There is only so much money, but we really need a realistic plan, a forward-thinking plan for shipbuilding, aircraft procurement, recruitment goals, infrastructure improvements, and backed by some kind of sustainable funding levels that are dependable. So this is something I'm looking at legislation, looking to work with. I know I've spoke to John Garamundi on the other side of the aisle, some other folks on this side of the aisle, to set benchmarks at least so we know where we should be instead of, and I'm not blaming you. Again, I've said this many times. I love you guys. You know, Kate May does. We're on board. But we just need to, instead of having every year and every session, every 2 years, having the same conversations, try to move forward, at least set out in a significant, substantive way what our goals are. Even if we fall short sometimes, we know where we fell short, we know what they are, instead of having, and again, our bad, I'm not blaming you, but just having these vague conversations where we go back and forth and say, hey, we're not up to snuff, we're not doing what we should do, and we're competing with others that are. So I'm gonna work on that. I don't know where it's gonna lead me, but we've been working on that already. We've spoken to Leg Council, we're drafting legislation. I don't know if it'll be in the form of resolution, we'll see. And I look forward to members on the other side and our chairman and others really working on this. I'd love to get down to it. You know, I don't, you know, if hopefully I'm here 2 years from now, I don't want you sitting there and me sitting here and saying, remember when we talked about this in the last session and the session before and the session before that, you know? So that's my goal. Do you think this is something the Coast Guard could appreciate, some sort of plan like that?
Sir, yes, I think we would love that. Just as we like GAO kind of looking over our shoulders, telling us, hey, you got $24 billion of shore infrastructure, you need to be spending 2 to 4% to maintain that, and we're not doing that. When you look at the depreciation of our shore infrastructure, and most of it's been depreciated a long time ago, and it's well past its service life, we think those benchmarks can help you understand, help us understand where we need that investment, that $7 billion in infrastructure, where we need those new cutters, and why we need them sooner than later. Yes, sir.
And I'm going to yield back, but I would say there's probably some more waste in the Department of Defense that we could use in the Coast Guard, but that you can't comment on that. I understand that. I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Ms. Shelton for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, and appreciate you holding for me. I was at 3 different hearings this morning, so we're getting the use out of my heels this morning. Mr. Ezell, thank you so much, and Ranking Member Carbajal, we appreciate this hearing. Vice Admiral Allan and Ms. MacLeod, it is great to see you both back here again. We appreciate your service. I would be remiss not to mention that we are under 10 days away from a potential government shutdown. During the first Trump administration, we experienced the longest government shutdown in history. And unfortunately, the Coast Guard was left behind. But we didn't forget about them. That is why I recently reintroduced my Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act with my colleague from Michigan, Representative Tom Barrett, to ensure that all Coasties are paid on time during a lapse in federal funds. I welcome my colleagues to join me in supporting this critical bill. Question 1, I am always proud to represent Coast Guard City, USA along the shore of Lake Michigan. However, coming off a significant winter back home, we still have a lot of ice on the Big Lake. I am disappointed that the acquisition of a new ice-breaking asset is continuously delayed. This includes the acquisition of a new heavy Great Lakes icebreaker and the recapitalization of a seriously aged 140-foot icebreaking tugs. Vice Admiral, I know we share a common goal of giving our coasties the resources they need to do their jobs well and keep our waters safe. Does the Coast Guard have an updated timeline for acquiring both types of new icebreakers on the Great Lakes?
Ma'am, thank you very much for that question, and thanks for going out with the crews and doing some ice training yourself. We appreciate that. They really appreciated that. What I would say is when we start talking about the Great Lakes icebreaker, I think this is the way that people are asking to do this. They want us to go out and figure out the design, how we're going to do it, and then once we have that design, go to shipyards and have it built. We are in that process, so we've done the requirements. We're looking for $25 million in fiscal year 25 for long lead time and material. And then we're looking for another $35 million in fiscal year 26 to complete analysis and down select that. That is a lot of time, but when you design new ships, we think that's what we need to be able to tell you, this is when it's going to be delivered, this is how long it's going to take, and this is where it's going.
And is continuing to fund at last year's dollars or even less under a continuing resolution, is that significant and appropriate?
So yes, ma'am, anytime we have a full year CR, it makes it a little bit more difficult. We appreciate the opportunity for anomalies as Congress allows us to do that.
Thank you. On to question 2. Michigan's 3rd congressional district is home to an incredible domestic manufacturing base, including Michigan Wheel, a 100-year-old company that makes propellers and rudders for the Coast Guard's fastest response cutters. I had the honor of touring with my sons. They were so impressed. Vice Admiral Allan, can you please touch on the importance of effectively run sustainment programs, especially for fleet workhorses like the FRC? Additionally, talk about how the Coast Guard ensures that maintenance and repair activities are properly funded, scheduled, and supported by companies that provide original components.
Ma'am, thank you for that question, and I appreciate it. I would like to tell you that we have broken the code on how we make sure it's adequately funded. Right now, for our surface fleet, we think we have a $500 million per year deficit in what we need to fund it. So we are making trade-offs within asset classes. What I will tell you is for the FRCs, for the fast response cutters, those continue to be, as you said, our workhorse and our #1 priority as far as our small craft. So we are doing everything to keep those up, maintained, and operating because they are able to fill a lot of holes for the Coast Guard all across the country.
Thank you. I'm going to get to question 3 very quickly, and I'm coming to you, Ms. MacLeod. I've previously talked a lot about how an extended shutdown would take a toll on our service members in the Coast Guard. However, the majority and the administration have failed if they fail to act, we will see major impacts to the Coast Guard service. Even if we see leadership pursue another continuing resolution, we are still limiting the Coast Guard's ability to plan ahead. Ms. MacLeod, when the government shuts down or passes continuing resolutions, what's the impact on shoreside infrastructure investments and long-term procurement?
During a continuing resolution or shutdown, no progress is made. And our analysis across the federal government has shown that even a short shutdown can have long-lasting effects months down the road for just a single day of a shutdown.
Thank you. I yield back. That was it. We got it in. Okay. Appreciate the additional 16 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Ezell.
Gentlelady yields. I have a few more questions that I'd like to ask, and if anybody else would like to bring anything up after I finish, you're welcome to. Admiral, what is the Coast Guard's assessment of the technical risk associated with a change to a propeller and shafting supplier between stages 1 and 2 OPC And how will the Coast Guard manage to interchangeably between Stage 1 and Stage 2 cutter propulsion systems?
Sir, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it, because I think we have a good approach to that. So, one, the design is not going to change for those shafts and those propellers. What we did have was a change from the manufacturer. So Rolls-Royce used to manufacture those parts, and now it's being done by another company. As that other company is doing it, what we, as a Coast Guard, need to do, along with our shipyards, is to ensure the quality of those same designs. So it's not a different design. Those same designs are met and delivered as we put them into our OPCs.
Thank you. Ms. Oakley, it's so good to see you again. Thank you for being here. What are your thoughts on the design, maturity, and propulsion system changes between Stages 1 and 2?
Yeah, so as I understand it, the biggest impact is that OPC 1 is not representative of what the ship will be, and therefore initial operational test has been moved to OPC 2. And that's why you see such a huge delay between the ships. And so that becomes a bit of a challenge, because then you'll have to go back and retrofit Stage 1, which I understand they do have a plan for, but that, not Stage 1, OPC 1, which I understand they do have a plan for, but that just takes additional time. And I would continue to indicate that, progress on OPC 2 is very, very slow right now. Pretty much most of the resources have been shifted to OPC 1. And so with that focus, I think you can continue to expect to see additional delays on that program.
Thank you. Admiral, the Coast Guard and Navy are working to build and maintain at least 3 polar security cutter heavy icebreakers to conduct missions in the Antarctic and the Arctic. Can you update us on the progress that's been made in moving the program forward?
Yes, sir. It's one of my favorite things to do right now, because we are moving forward. So when you talk about the Polar Security Cutter and where we've been, there's been a trail of sorrow, but we are getting there. We are at 91.75% on our design maturity. We've got 7 out of 18 prefab units that are complete, and we're continuing to build. Bollinger, Mississippi is bringing on more and more workers to maintain a steady state, so they can not only build 1 Polar Security Cutter, but they can build number 2 and number 3 that we so desperately need. And we've just recently agreed to some more things that brought them out of breach as they sought to fix the contract that they inherited when they bought the shipyard. And we're expecting DHS to give us full production design authority in this at the beginning of the 3rd quarter of this fiscal year. So a lot to be happy with. In fact, the Commandant is down there today with OMB. And Mr. Planky, they're taking a look at that shipyard, and I'm pleased to have them do that, because there's some great workers down there. They're going to show what they're doing.
Thank you. When do you expect the first hull to be delivered, and when will you require additional funding? And will you require additional funding for the program?
Yes, sir. We expect right now, while we are dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but we think the first one will be delivered in 2030, and then with additional funding, we can deliver number 2 and number 3 on 2-year centers. So think 2032, 2034.
Did the Coast Guard and Navy require significant design changes to the PSC program after the current shipbuilder acquired the yard from VT Halter? Did delays in providing government-furnished information and government-furnished equipment contribute to the delays? And if so, how will you incorporate the lessons learned into subsequent acquisitions?
Sir, what I would say is the biggest issue with designing the Polar Security Cutter is that we are one of the only countries in the world that are designing and building a heavy icebreaker that has multi-mission capabilities. That's the biggest problem. It's very technically difficult to build, and we had to do a number of different designs, even from how we're operating the Polar Star. It was great to see Bollinger, Mississippi bring in the right engineers, the people with expertise and backgrounds into this, and to watch how fast that design matured when we had the right people on the job.
Does the Coast Guard have any concerns with S-216, the Save Our Seas 2.0 Amendment Acts, that was recently ordered, reported from the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation?
Sir, with anything that we think will help the Coast Guard or nation, we are behind, and we are happy to provide any thoughts or comments that you would see beneficial.
Ms. MacLeod, the Coast Guard is confronting a costly backlog of shore infrastructure projects. GAO recently updated its findings to reflect that the backlog is $7 billion, and nearly half of the Coast Guard's shore infrastructure is beyond its life service. This backlog is exacerbated by a lack of budget transparency. Can you detail your main takeaways and recommendations following GAO's study on shoreside infrastructure?
Certainly, thank you. So the Coast Guard recently took steps to address one of our recommendations, for example, by acquiring a modeling system that will help them assess the costs. And so that is one tool that, once it has the information in it, we'll be following up with them to make sure that they're using that modeling tool to make the decisions and trade-offs. Another aspect is, a lot of the projects that we're talking about in terms of shore infrastructure have not been updated since their original estimates, nor have they been adjusted for inflation. And so we suspect the backlog is actually much higher, and better information related to the actual cost of the backlog is something we'd like to see from the Coast Guard.
In your opinion, what can this committee do to help the Coast Guard overcome these issues and provide more detailed and accurate information to Congress?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
In your opinion, what can this committee do to help the Coast Guard overcome these issues and provide more detailed and accurate information to Congress?
So the Coast Guard does have a shore infrastructure report that it shares internally, that it could provide to Congress. In addition to that, greater detail about the trade-offs that the Coast Guard is making when it's putting forward the decisions, knowing the risk level of the projects. Are you going forward with one project related to an ongoing maintenance issue as opposed to a necessary pier for a new acquisition? Those are the types of details we'd like to see in the information they're providing to Congress.
Thank you. Mr. Carbajal, do you have anything you'd like to?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a question. The GAO has stated that its infrastructure backlog is $7 billion, and that an annual increase of up to $1 billion would be necessary to keep up with annual maintenance. Included in the bipartisan infrastructure law were necessary funding for Coast Guard shoreside infrastructure. The Coast Guard has confirmed that the remaining not yet obligated funding is under consideration for rescission under the Unleashing American Energy Executive Order. Among them are child development centers in Kodiak, Alaska, Astoria, Oregon, Mobile, Alabama, housing in Seward and Kodiak, Alaska, and New York, maintenance in Ketchikan, Alaska, and pier and infrastructure work in Pensacola, Florida. Admiral Allan, have those projects been completed? And does the Coast Guard no longer need this funding?
Sir, I'm not familiar with what you're talking about specifically. I will tell you, in all those locations, we have ongoing projects, and we very much need that infrastructure. So if, with your permission, I'd like to get more details and then be able to answer that question on the record.
Okay, and again, it's specifically to the executive order that would rescind that funding that's already been approved and unobligated but appropriated. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I have one more. The Coast Guard has not budgeted for nor executed congressionally mandated actions included in the FY '22 U.S. Coast Guard Reauthorization Act, which directed the Coast Guard to bring commercial, surface, autonomy, and computer vision solutions to the operational components of the Coast Guard. What is the Coast Guard's plan to budget for and execute this technology project this fiscal year and to continue to expand upon in the following fiscal years? Admiral?
Sir, thank you for that question. I will tell you, as we look at those technologies, we see those as ones that increase our maritime domain awareness, provide us better ability to use the assets we have, but don't replace any of those. We are looking at the ability to add those things onto our assets and figure out how we're doing it. I will tell you right now, we are in trade-offs where we are looking to fund the bare necessities and not the extras. So we are looking at those. Our R&D center is looking at those. We would enjoy the opportunity to take advantage of those, but right now the trade-offs are not allowing us.
Very good, thank you. Thank you. Everybody yields back. Are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each and every one of you for being here today and for providing us with this important testimony. The subcommittee stands adjourned.